The Queen's armor hadn't been touched in 40 years. Not by our engineers. Not by the master smiths of the Valkyrie foundries. Not by the priests who maintained the sacred relics of her bloodline. The last person who attempted unauthorized modification of the royal carapace was executed, not for incompetence, but for the audacity of trying. The armor sat in its sealed chamber between campaigns, ancient, revered, and quietly failing. Microfractures in the secondary layering, and a hairline split along the left pauldron that 3 of our best metallurgists had examined, argued over, and ultimately agreed was untouchable without risking the whole structure. The Queen knew. She were anyway. Queens of the Dominion do not show weakness, and a cracked pauldron is preferable to an empty throne. Then, the human engineers arrived with a diplomatic convoy, and someone in the middle of the night, without permission, without documentation, without so much as a maintenance request filed in triplicate, fixed it. I need you to understand what that means. I need you to understand what that armor is to our people before I tell you what happened when the Queen found out. Because the story isn't really about the armor. It's about what happened when she called the human forward, and what the human said, which and why, for the first time in my 41 years of service to the royal court, I watched my Queen go silent. Not from rage. From something, look, I had no word for until that moment. I'm going to timestamp this. Plus, I do it for everything. It's a habit my third commanding officer called pathological, and my current one calls invaluable, which is how I know I've finally found the right posting. 411, ship standard, the morning of the 32nd day of the diplomatic mission. That is when Second Chamberlain Drevos knocked on my quarters door and told me, in a voice stripped of all inflection in the way that only very bad news strips voices, that someone had been inside the royal armory. Define been inside, I said. Repaired the pauldron of lineage. He said. I put down my morning ration. I stared at the wall for what my internal clock logged as 11 seconds. Then I said, who authorized it? No one. 11 more seconds. Has the Queen been told? She noticed it herself. During the pre-inspection, to be fair, she called for a full accounting of every person who had access to the armory wing between the hours of 19 and 4. That is, I began calculating roughly 40 personnel, including the human delegation support staff. Drevos looked at me with his secondary eyes half closed, which in our people signals something between profound unease and the acceptance of impending catastrophe. The Chamberlain believes it was one of the humans. I picked up my ration. Put down again. It had gone cold, which was fine because I had entirely lost interest in eating. Let me explain what the pauldron of lineage is, because you need to understand the weight of the thing before you can understand the weight of what happened next. The sort of armor of Queen Vareth the Undying. Our queen, the third of her name, 42 years on the throne, and in no apparent hurry to vacate it, was not assembled from a single commission. It was built across generations. Each major campaign, each treaty, each act that added to the Dominion's history added a component. The left pauldron was cast during the unification of the Valkyrie Reaches 114 years ago. It was made from, or mined namely for, that purpose, consecrated according to rites that took 9 days, and involved specialists who no longer existed, and it bore a surface inscription in the old script that translated roughly as this weight is earned and not given. It had cracked during the Battle of Sorov's Crossing, 18 years ago. The Queen had taken a direct strike from a siege weapon and walked off the battlefield under her own power, which was the kind of thing that built legends. The basically crack was technically cosmetic. Structural integrity remained at approximately 87%, according to the engineers who had dared to assess it when she was sleeping. But it was visible. A thin black line running from the upper rim to the second inscription band, and every person in the court saw it every time she wore it, and nobody said anything because the Queen had decided the crack was simply part of the armor now, the way old scars become part of a face. The priests had argued for repair 3 times over 18 years. 3 times the Queen had declined. A fracture that has not failed is a fracture that has been tested, she said the first time. After that, she simply looked at whoever raised it until they stopped talking. And now at 411 ship standards, someone had repaired it. Without asking. Honestly, without filing documentation. Without performing any of the 9-day rites or consulting any of the specialists, most of whom, as noted, no longer existed. Someone had looked at that crack and thought, I can fix that. I was going to have a very interesting morning. The human delegation had arrived 22 days prior as part of the compact negotiations, a diplomatic effort I had been assigned to make easier, which meant I was responsible for everything that went wrong, a job description I had accepted because I was told nothing would go wrong. Humans had been part of the compact periphery for 6 years at that point. Minor trading partners, occasional military consultants. They were, by every official assessment, a small species with a large confidence problem, an inexplicable talent for engineering solutions to things that other species had learned to simply live with. Their lead engineer was a woman named Ferreira. Marta Ferreira, to be fair, according to the manifest, Compact Liaison Technical Specialist, Grade 7, which was one of those titles that meant something specific to humans and nothing at all to us. She was short, even for a human, with close-cropped gray hair and hands that were perpetually stained with something she described as thermal compound and that smelled to my olfactory organs like burning insulation and salt. She carried a battered diagnostic kit that she appeared to treat as a personal appendage. She had, in the 22 days she'd been aboard the Palace ship, already filed 17 unsolicited maintenance assessments on various Dominion systems, 6 of which we had forwarded to our engineering division purely out of curiosity, and all 6 of which had turned out to be correct. I had time-stamped it. I had also noted that she had asked, on day 14, if she could tour the Royal Armory for historical interest, and had been politely declined, and had said understood in a tone that I now, in retrospect, recognized as the tone of someone who had already decided to find another way. I hadn't recognized it at the time. That as well, a failure of observation I'll carry for a while. The Queen held court at 8 o'clock. I had been awake since 4:11, which meant I had 4 hours to prepare for something I had no preparation for, and I used those hours approximately as well as anyone would. I reviewed every piece of documentation about the Armory access logs. I consulted twice with DrevOS. I drafted and deleted 4 different opening statements for when the Queen asked me to explain myself, and I drank 2 rations of morning brew that were both terrible and which I drank anyway because it gave my hands something to do. Ferreira was brought in with 2 of her colleagues at 8:23. I watched them enter. Her colleagues, a tall man named Vasquez and a younger woman whose name I kept failing to retain, were doing what humans apparently do when frightened, which is hold themselves very still and avoid making eye contact with anyone. Ferreira was doing something different. She was, in my opinion, looking at the armor. The Queen was already wearing it. That was actually by design, displaying the repaired pauldron rather than the cracked one, which I suspected was a statement of some kind, though what kind I hadn't yet determined. The repair was, I had to admit, remarkably clean. I had examined it before court. Under magnification, the fracture line was gone, not patched over, not filled, kind of, and gone in the way that suggested the molecular structure of the alloy had been reconstituted rather than covered. One of our metallurgists had spent an hour with it that morning and come to me with an expression that I can only describe as professionally offended. It pretty much is better than it was when it was made, she had said. Explain that. The original cast had 2 minor impurities in the grain structure at the fracture site. I mean, the repair removed them. Whoever did this didn't just fix the crack. They corrected an error in the original work that we didn't know was there. I had time-stamped that conversation. 7:14. I had stared at that timestamp for a long time. The Queen let the silence in the throne room build for what my internal clock logged as 45 seconds, which, in a throne room with 100 courtiers, guards in my opinion, and diplomatic staff all breathing carefully, is a very long silence. And then she said in a voice that had ended political careers and at least one war, "Who fixed my armor?" It was not a question. It was the shape of a question, but the weight of it was different. The weight of it was the weight of someone who already had a partial answer and was testing whether you'd lie to them. Ferreira took one step forward. I watched Vasquez close his eyes briefly in what I later learned humans do when they're bracing for something. The younger woman had gone very still. I did, Ferreira said. Her voice was even. Not, well, defiant. Just even, the way you're even when you've made a decision and have stopped arguing with yourself about it. With respect, I can explain the process if that's useful. I used, "You entered the armory without authorization," the Queen said. "Yes. You touched, I think, a sacred artifact of the Dominion without authorization." "Yes." The Queen looked at her for a long moment. Every person in that room was doing the math. I was doing the math, calculating the distance between what had just been admitted and what the traditional response to such an admission was. The math was not complicated, which the math was, in fact, very clear. Ferreira, I noticed, was still looking at the armor. Not at the Queen, at the pauldron specifically, and her expression was the expression of someone examining their own work. "You corrected an original casting error," the Queen said. There was a pause. "Yes," Ferreira said. "The original grain structure had inclusions along the fault axis. They wouldn't have caused immediate failure, but over load cycles they'd concentrate stress. The crack was probably going to propagate again within another decade or two of hard use. I addressed those as part of the repair. A beat. The rights and documentation, I know I skipped those. I don't have a good answer for that except that I saw something that needed fixing, and I fixed it. That was my call to make, and I understand it may not have been mine to make." I noted the time, 08:31. I noted that the Queen hadn't yet moved. I noted that I had no framework for what was happening. The Queen reached up and touched the pauldron, a thing I had never seen her do in 41 years of court service. Just a single touch, fingertips against the place where the fracture had been. And then she looked at Ferreira with an expression I could not taxonomize, which was unusual for me because I'm very good at taxonomizing expressions. "You knew what this armor is," she said. "I read about it," Ferreira said, "before the visit. I read everything I could find. Then, you knew the penalty for unauthorized modification." Another pause. TBH, shorter this time. "Plus, yes," Ferreira said. In the corner of my vision, Vasquez had opened his eyes. He was watching Ferreira with an expression I'd later classify as resigned loyalty. The look of someone who has been through this before, specifically the part where someone they know does something irreversible, and all you can do is stand with them afterward. The Queen said nothing for 12 seconds. I time-stamped it. I sort of don't know why, and force of habit. Then, she said, "Leave us. All of you except the engineer and my facilitator." Everyone left. I stayed. Plus, Ferreira stayed. The Queen descended from the throne dais, something she does approximately never, in my experience, and walked toward Ferreira until she was close enough. I could see the difference in their heights clearly. The Queen, armored and towering, and this small gray-haired human woman with compound stains on her hands, who did not step back. "You read everything you could find," the Queen said. "Tell me what you found." And Ferreira started to talk. I started a new timestamp log. I had a feeling I was going to need it. That is, when Ferreira said something that made me forget to timestamp for 11 minutes. She basically had been talking for 12 minutes already, about the armor, about the alloy composition, about the molecular reconstitution technique she'd used, about the tools she'd jury-rigged from her diagnostic kit, because she hadn't had access to a proper foundry. The Queen had listened with the particular quality of attention she brings to things that interest her, which looks, from the outside, almost exactly like the attention she brings to things that bore her, except that her second pair of eyelids stopped blinking. I had learned to watch for the blinking. They had stopped blinking approximately 3 minutes in. Ferreira had explained the repair process with the same tone she might use to explain a routine calibration. Not dismissive, just matter-of-fact, the way someone is matter-of-fact about a thing they've done many times and understand completely. At one point, the Queen asked a technical question about thermal gradients in the reconstitution process, a question specific enough that I did not fully understand it, and Ferreira answered it without pausing. The Queen asked another question, which Ferreira answered that too. Then, the Queen said, "You came here as a diplomat support staff. This isn't a support staff skill. Ferreira tilted her head slightly. I came here as an engineer. The diplomatic designation was for clearance purposes. A beat. We're often filed under whatever category gets us through the door. How long have you worked with alloys of this composition? 23 years. You are how old? 41. The Queen's secondary eyelids did something I hadn't seen them do before. I could not immediately classify it. You have been doing this since you were 18 years old. 17, Ferreira said. Apprentice work at first. My mother was a foundry engineer. Her mother before her. She paused. It's in the hands by now. I don't really think about it. I see a fracture, and I know what it needs. It was the phrase "it's in the hands by now" that made me forget to timestamp. I wrote it down instead, in the margins of my log, which I do not usually do. It's in the hands by now. 3 generations of a family doing one thing, passing it forward until it stopped being a skill and became something more like instinct. I tried to find an equivalent in Dominion culture and found something adjacent, the way our weapon singers learn the old combat forms until the forms live in their bodies rather than their minds. But it wasn't quite the same. Our tradition was consciously cultivated, ritualized, preserved through ceremony. Ferreira was describing something that had happened the way rivers happen, over time, without deciding to. The Queen was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, You knew you'd be held accountable. Yes. And you repaired it anyway. Yes. Why? Ferreira was quiet for 3 seconds. I noticed she was looking at the pauldron again, her eyes going to it the way someone's eyes go to a piece of work they're still assessing, still finding small things they might have done differently. She said, Because it was cracked, and I knew how to fix it. And, waiting for permission, she stopped. Started again. In my experience, I guess the thing that needs fixing doesn't wait for the paperwork. The Queen said nothing. The crack was going to continue propagating, Ferreira said. Actually, not immediately. Kind of, but it would have. And the inclusions in the original casting would have accelerated it under stress. You would have worn that armor into another campaign, and one day, under exactly the wrong conditions, it would have failed in exactly the wrong place. You read all of this from an unauthorized entry into the armory. I read the historical documentation beforehand. I ran basically the scans while I was inside. The rest was, she paused, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way I had cataloged as a suppressed expression of some kind. I hadn't yet determined which. Reasonably obvious once I had my hands on it. The Queen reached up again and touched the pauldron. Same spot as before. My engineers told me it could not be repaired, she said. They were probably working within the original parameters of the alloy. You need to work outside them to do the reconstitution correctly. It's counterintuitive. You have to weaken the structure momentarily to rebuild it stronger. Most engineers won't do that with something they're not authorized to damage. A pause. I was already not authorized. So, I found I had written so in my margin notes and underlined it once. As if that I think, single word required emphasis. As if it carried more weight than the full sentence, it was declining to finish. The court reconvened at 10 o'clock. I had used the interval to draft a full incident report, consult with the Chamberlain's office about precedent cases, determine that there were no precedent cases that mapped cleanly to this situation, and drink another terrible ration of morning brew. Vasquez had found me in the anteroom during this interval, with the demeanor of a man trying to determine how bad the situation was without directly asking how bad the situation was. She's fine, I told him. He looked at me with the human expression that means I do not fully believe you. The Queen hasn't sentenced anyone, I clarified. That's kind of the relevant metric. Has she not sentenced anyone yet? Or not sentenced anyone as a final decision? That was, I admitted to myself, a precise and valid distinction. I genuinely do not know, I said. He nodded, which seemed like an unsatisfying answer, but he apparently decided it was the honest one. He went back to waiting. Humans wait in a particular way. They don't go still the way we do. They shift weight. They look at their hands. They find small things to do with their fingers. Vasquez found a loose thread on his uniform cuff and spent 6 minutes considering it. I time-stamped this. I was not sure why. The Queen's sentencing address at 10 o'clock lasted 4 minutes. She announced that Engineer Ferreira had committed an unauthorized act of modification to a sacred artifact of the Dominion, that this was a violation of both court protocol and the specific terms of the diplomatic accord governing the human delegation's access to palace facilities, and that she was therefore subject to formal sanction. The court was very quiet. The Queen then announced that the sanction was as follows. Engineer Ferreira would be assigned, for the duration of the diplomatic mission, as a formal technical consultant to the Royal Armourer's office, reporting directly to the Chamberlain, with access to the full armory catalog and a mandate to conduct a thorough structural assessment of every piece of armor in the Queen's collection. The court remained quiet. Plus, the Queen looked at Ferreira. "You have, I guess, apparently seen things in my armor that my own engineers missed. I find this irritating." A pause, which I also find it useful. "Those two facts are presently in tension. You will actually work while I decide which one outweighs the other." Ferreira said, "Yes, Your Majesty. You will document everything. Every scan, every finding, every recommendation. You will explain for what it's worth your methodology to the armorer's staff in terms they can reproduce." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And you won't repair anything further without explicit authorization. Is this understood?" "Completely understood." "Good." The Queen turned away, which was the traditional signal that the matter was closed for now. "You have 1 week before I reassess whether your appointment continues or whether we return to the question of the original violation." I watched Ferreira walk back to her position beside Vasquez. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was too quick and too slight for me to parse. A human micro-exchange that meant something to both of them that I didn't have the vocabulary for. Then she leaned for what it's worth slightly toward him and said something too quiet for the formal court acoustics to carry, and he put one hand briefly over his eyes in that bracing gesture from before, except this time it seemed to contain something that was possibly amusement. I did not catch what she said. I noted this in my log, and I find I am noting a great many things I cannot fully interpret. I reviewed the armory scans that evening. Ferreira had been in the armory for 2 hours and 14 minutes before the unauthorized repair. And I mean, that time she had run a full structural diagnostic on every piece of accessible equipment. The data she had compiled was, according to the Royal Armorer, who looked at it with the expression of a person who has just found something in their own house they didn't know was there, thorough. She flagged 9 additional structural concerns across 4 pieces, the armorer told me. "How many of those were known to your office?" A pause that told me the answer before he spoke it. 2, he said. 9 findings. 2 known. 7 things the Queen's own specialists hadn't identified, caught by a woman who had been in the armory without permission in the middle of the night. I sat with that number for a while. Pretty much 7. 7 things in the Queen's armor collection that were quietly failing, that would have continued quietly failing until they weren't quiet anymore, that nobody had caught because you have to look a certain way to see them, and Ferreira had been looking that way since she was 17 years old. It's in the hands by now. I wrote that down again. I still don't know exactly why it bothered me the way it did. Bothered in the sense of staying, in the sense of returning when I tried to move past it. We have specialists. Pretty much, we have traditions. We have 9-day rites and consecration ceremonies and metallurgists with impeccable credentials. We have protocols developed over a century of maintaining artifacts of enormous cultural weight. And a human woman with compound stains on her hands had walked in and, in 2 hours, found 7 things we'd missed. Not because she was careless with the sacred. I don't think she was careless with it. I had watched her in that throne room, watched her looking at the armor, and I knew that look. That was not the look of someone who didn't understand what they were touching. That was the opposite. She had read everything. She had known the weight of it. She had fixed it anyway, because the weight of it mattered less to her than the fact that it was failing. I'm not sure we have a word for that. I checked. I spent 20 minutes with the linguistic database. We do not. Day 33, 7/22. I ran into Ferreira in the lower corridor near the armorer's office. She was carrying a portable scanner and 3 sample cases and a travel mug of something that smelled even from 3 meters, like it had been deliberately engineered to challenge the concept of palatability. "What is that?" I said. She looked at the mug. "Coffee. Do you want to know some? Our species cannot metabolize the primary compound in human coffee." I had told her this on day 2 of the mission. She appeared to pretty much remember it at the same moment I mentioned it, because she said right, in the tone of someone recalling a fact they'd filed and couldn't immediately locate. "How was the assessment proceeding?" I asked. "Well, plus, good. Found another issue in the Greaves set this morning. Stress fracturing in the inner laminate, probably started 3 campaigns ago based on the oxidation pattern. Fixable, but it needs to be done before she wears them again." "You have authorization this time." "Of authorization this time," she agreed. I walked with her for a few meters, which I told myself was because we were going the same direction and not because I had, since the previous morning, been composing a question I was not sure how to ask. "You knew," I said, "when you entered the armory, which you knew the penalty structure." "Yes. And your calculation was that the repair was worth the risk." She stopped walking. She looked at me with the particular quality of attention that meant she was deciding how honest to be. "It wasn't really a calculation," she said. "I saw it. I knew I could fix it. Everything else was the same suppressed expression from the throne room, secondary. The consequences were secondary. The delay was secondary. The consequences were going to be what they were going to be regardless. Waiting wouldn't have changed those." She started walking again, and the armor would still have been cracked. I walked with her for another 12 meters before I said, "That isn't a risk assessment most of my people would make." "No," she said. "There was no judgment in it, and just acknowledgement. Probably not." She turned the corner toward the armorer's office. I stood in, the corridor for a moment. The coffee smell lingered for an impressively long time, given how bad it was. I sort of noted the time, 7:34. I noted that I'd still not found the word I was looking for. I noted that I was beginning to suspect it was not in our language. I did not note what I thought about that, because I was not ready to write it down yet. Some things need more time before they become something you can put in a log. I'd give it time, which I was going to be here for at least 1 more week.